Let's talk a little bit about the Democratic National Convention. I'm really excited to just pass along a few highlights. I know it was a long week, I'm sure a busy one for you, and I love doing these summaries. So I hope it's helpful, and I hope in the end it makes you a little bit smarter, which is our goal at Smarter News. So I'm going to use your questions as well to guide us through this report, which I'm also really thankful and excited about. Suze, you had a great question. What is the story behind conventions and why do they even exist? This is a great place to start. Conventions in the good old days used to be where parties would actually nominate their candidates, and you would go into a convention maybe not knowing who would emerge as the leader. That's not what happens these days. What happens now is that we go into a convention and we know more or less who the nominee is going to be. There are very few surprises. But why it's important as a journalist, but also as a voter, is that over the last several months, the parties have had an opportunity to try out a lot of material. And at the conventions, they have one big open mic, and they get to choose what is their message that they want to portray. How they prioritize that message tells us a lot about the argument that they're making to the American public, and how they actually want to talk about the election in the weeks leading up to actually voting day. So this is exciting. We get to see a lot of people talk from the different parties. We get to see a lot of potentially diverse voices, and it's exciting to be able to hear directly from the source, which is, as a journalist, is something that I really value. Golderline, you had a great question. You said sum it up in 30 seconds or less. What was Vice President Joe Biden's message to the American public? And I could sum it up in one line from his speech last night. I am an ally of the light, not the darkness. He drew that real direct contrast, saying that he is the light versus the darkness that is part of the White House at this particular moment. He didn't really talk a lot about President Trump by name, but that's not true of all the speakers. Many of the speakers did also draw a very stark contrast between the choice for Vice President Joe Biden and President Trump. A word that came up time and time and time again, almost every single day in my memory, is the word decent. Talking about Vice President Joe Biden as a decent man, that he had decency, which is an interesting word choice if you think about it. We all know what decent means, but maybe it's not a word that we use really frequently. This is part of the messaging. Vice President Joe Biden is the good that could come into the White House, part of good leadership for the American public, bring light with him, and is a decent man. That's really their argument for his candidacy for president. Aaron, you asked, what is the platform of the Democrats? What exactly are they proposing? And that's an interesting question, because what we got a lot from the Democratic National Convention is a lot of personal stories, not a deep dive on policy. So we heard a lot of the personal stories of Senator Kamala Harris, who's the presidential nominee. We heard a lot of the personal story of Vice President Joe Biden. Both of them have extraordinary stories. Senator Harris is a daughter of immigrants who was raised mainly by her single mom when her parents split up, and rose through the ranks to now become the first African-American vice presidential nominee. You have Vice President Joe Biden really surviving tragedy in his life, where he lost his wife and young child early on, also lost his son in recent years, and said that he really turned towards his work for purpose through that tragedy. So we heard a lot about these personal stories. Whether or not we got real specific details on Middle East policy, policy regarding China, violence in American cities, defunding the police, we didn't get a lot of specifics on that. That's not what the Democrats chose to put forward. Doesn't mean that we won't see it eventually, but we didn't get it here. So we walk away from this convention not with a ton of policy specifics, but more of a reintroduction, if you will, to the Democrat Party. One part of this that we saw with the Democrats that we're not necessarily going to see with the Republicans is the deep bench of Democratic leadership. So we heard from former President Bill Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, former President Barack Obama, First Lady Michelle Obama. These really strong leading Democrat voices came out in support of Vice President Joe Biden. We're not necessarily going to see that next week, in part because we don't have a lot of living former Republican presidents, and former President George W. Bush is not a huge outward supporter of President Trump. So we're not going to see that in the same way with the Republicans. It is a little bit of a double-edged sword, though. On the one hand, you see the depth of the Democrats and how over the years that they've supplied leadership in America. That can be viewed as a great thing, or that association can be viewed as a negative, depending on where you're sitting. But it's important to note because I think it's unique for this particular convention during this particular cycle. Jen, you asked, what about this mask mandate, this federal mask mandate? And that really brings us to our third point. What was said about the pandemic, about the COVID-19 pandemic? We got a little bit of that. Overall, the Democrats are putting what's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic solely in the responsibility of President Trump. Everything from the loss of jobs related to the pandemic to the loss of lives. Senator Kamala Harris really drew a very straight line between what's happening with the COVID-19 pandemic and systemic racism because of the disparity in how COVID-19 is emerging in minority communities. This is a very direct connection that they are trying to draw to say President Trump is responsible for how this COVID-19 has emerged in America, how the COVID-19 pandemic has emerged in America. That is their argument. As part of the argument, they talked about a couple things that they would do different. Again, not a ton of specifics, but some of the points include taking a muzzle off the experts, saying they really want to turn to science to help solve this problem, to deploy more rapid testing quickly across the country, and yes, a mask mandate, a federal mask mandate. What would that mandate look like? Would it look like I walk out the door here in my neighborhood and I would need to wear a mask? Or is it in particular areas? We don't have the specifics on that, but it is part of the proposal that was mentioned, by the way, by Vice President Joe Biden last night in his major address. So those are really the 3 points that you need to know about. There were a lot of personal stories over policy. There was definitely reference to the pandemic as well and the association with President Trump. And as far as platform specifics, we're going to have to do more research beyond the convention to really get an understanding about where the party stands. And that's that again is a really interesting choice. Do voters need the specifics, or do they need the broader choice that the Democrats are trying to portray? Light versus darkness. And I'll leave that question up to you. I'm curious what you think about that. Quick final note, on our website, we're going to put this video under Coffee Talk, and underneath the video, I'm going to put links so you can listen to some of the major speeches so you can catch up if you want to. But in my research, I found a great recording from a former famous news anchor, Walter Cronkite, talking about how he covered the first televised national convention in 1952. And it's really cool to listen to. It's like 10 minutes. It's worth your time, brings you back to a different point in America, and I really enjoyed it. Features like that are going to be what we're going to include in our newsletter that starts back up in the fall. Features that I think are helpful to illuminate our current news cycle, but you may not find everywhere else. And so I want to give you a couple fun things to read on the weekend. So that's what we're going to be doing. All right, I hope that answers some of your questions, but I'm sure you have others. So please send them to me. We want to be helpful, and we're going to help you through this process as we get closer to Election Day. We're so thankful for this opportunity, and we're having a lot of fun. So we appreciate that as well. Have a great day, guys, and as always, more on smarternews.com.